Hey guys, welcome back to the One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute with your host Alan Bishop, the channel where we do our best to answer your distilling related questions either from a hobby perspective or a professional perspective within the realms of knowledge that I feel like I can offer to you based upon the things I have learned within this industry. So, as always, if you have questions, please reach out, bishopshomegrown@gmail.com, any of my social media, or in the YouTube comments. Today we're just filming from the bedroom, so nothing special. I just got in from outside doing a little yard work. It's pretty damn hot out there, I'm not going to lie, so kind of glad to be inside in the air conditioning. And, I don't like to be lazy, and I never have liked to be lazy, but starting to appreciate air conditioning as I get just a little older. Not much, but a little older. Starting to appreciate air conditioning come, late July and August for sure. So, didn't used to be that way, but I've broken myself working in distilleries and working on the farm for years, and I'm not ashamed of it. So, today we've got another email from Dan the Man, and he says, "Hey, I'm more than happy to provide the questions if you remain happy in answering them. Always, man. Send any questions you ever have, and if I can answer them, I gladly will, for sure. Here's another that I keep wondering about. How important is pH and how much is it the effect rather than the cause of stalled washes and mashes? After doing a lemon wash vodka, lots of lemon and rind and sugar, and watching the ferment take off with no adjustments, I became skeptical of all the ballyhoo on the subject. I think pH is blamed for a whole lot more problems than it deserves to be. How far off am I?" Excuse me. And aside, relative to your social media publishing, would you be better hosting it all on YouTube or etc. etc.? And that's secondary to the question. So I'll start with the pH question. So it can be a little bit of twofold. So I have done citrus washes before, and I've done them without making adjustments too. I've done them without even checking the pH, and they've been fine. Now, that doesn't mean they would always be fine, and bear in mind that the pH of citrus can be kind of all over the place. Most of the time, yeast is not going to like an environment below 3.4, 3.2 pH, and even then, that's pretty questionable except with certain wine yeast strains. You have to bear in mind that as you ferment, your pH is dropping, right? And it has to have room to be able to drop. It can only drop so far before it stalls out. Now, secondarily, the thing that also happens with fermentation, if it gets stuck, either from a lack of nutrients, sometimes that can happen in a fruit wash in particular. You shouldn't have that problem ever, even without adding nutrients to anything grain-based, even if it is a sugar shine, because there's plenty of nutrients already there within that grain, right? And if you're doing a sugar shine, it's on multiple generations, right? So you've gone back onto the same grain bed. You have all those dead yeast cells there as budding sites for the yeast as well as nutrients. But what can happen if you do stall out because your pH was already too low to start with, or because you have a lack of nutrients, is that you'll get a secondary infection, a bacterial infection or contamination of some sort that will further drop the yeast and further stall that particular ferment. So it's a little bit of both. My suggestion is to anybody that's serious about distilling, if you're going to do more than just sugar washes and you're going to do more than just sugar shine, invest in a decent pH meter. It's not going to hurt to know what the pH is and understand what the range of the yeast is. Also study the yeast that you're using. Know what pH ranges it operates at. It should drop pH while it's fermenting to some degree, but like we mentioned with maintaining our own yeast varieties, or at least maintaining my variety, I have a secondary malolactic bacteria that travels with that particular yeast strain, or with those particular yeast strains, that once that yeast is most of the way finished, that malolactic kicks in, then it drops pH. That's what I want. That way, if a wash, I can't get to it for a day or two, or something goes wrong, I'm at a pH where nothing else can get in there, right? And it just causes that yeast to go dormant, which is really what usually happens with a stalled out ferment. You haven't usually killed the yeast, you've caused it to go dormant. You can raise that pH and usually kick that yeast back off by aerating a little bit with any number of different products out there that you can raise pH with. Obviously, do your research and figure out what you like and what you trust. I've done it many times. But for me, typically, let's say with an all grain mash or wash, I would prefer my pH to start off at 5.5 if I can. When it's finished, I might expect it to be down to as low as 4.8. I've had them drop lower than that before, but 4.8 for my yeast strains is pretty common by the time a mash or a wash is finished. With fruits, depends on what it is, particularly with grapes, but most fruit washes I would prefer somewhere between, let's say, 3.8 and 4.5 on my pH. right? With grapes and things like cranberry and things of that nature, you might drop down into the 3.5 range, and it could stall out potentially. So you might even want to look at raising the pH just a little bit there to give it a little bit more room, a little bit more of a buffer zone, if you will. The other thing about that is with grapes. I just mentioned grapes. So a lot of brandy distilling with traditional grape brandy relies on picking those grapes at the proper Brix level as well as pH. And there are certain grapes, especially more terpene driven grapes, that you're not going to pick at a low pH. So something like Muscat might be up in the 4.0 to 4.1, 4.2, very floral. Same thing with Catawba. It may be at a higher range, whereas something like Traminette may be down in the mid 3s. There's a big difference based on flavor and aroma quality, etc. So do I think that pH plays a factor? I do, with fermentation in general. Do I also think that pH dropping is a side effect of yeast crash? I do. It's a little bit of both, right? And you could spend the next 10, 15 years distilling and never measure pH one time and never have one problem. But the one time you do, just think of it this way. How much time did you potentially waste? How much money may you have wasted? How far into that fermentation were you? Is that fermentation salvageable without any sort of off flavors such as VA, etc., or even Brettanomyces, which to me is fairly off-putting in a distillation, but that's just to me. Better to save yourself some time and money. If you're going to invest enough in distillation knowledge to understand distillation, understand all grain mashes, and understand true brandies, invest in yourself enough to buy a good pH meter and track it so that you know where it's at and you know what to expect. Understand your yeast enough to know how much pH it's going to drop. Understand sour mashing. If you're going to start a 5.5, 5.6 pH and you add 10 gallons of backset to a 50-gallon barrel, understand how much that's going to drop the pH. Understand even citric acid and things of that nature to be able to adjust. Now, again, if it's just sugar shine, none of this is really necessary, right? This is more an involvement thing. If you're going to be involved enough to go deep, deep, deep into the heart of distillation, start really understanding base alcohols, and start really understanding some of the, for lack of any other way of explaining it, some of the higher forms of distillation, some of the more traditional forms of distillation, it is very much worthwhile to know those things. Now, yes, you're correct. Prior to the 1800s, nobody really knew, right? Now, they had an idea by tasting it. They distilled for years and years and years, and generationally, they'd have some idea of whether or not the pH was where they wanted it at, whether or not they did adjust it, could adjust it, understood how to adjust it. Even though some of these people were obviously not scientists, and they were maybe what you would think of as more backwoodsy, or even at that time peasants, obviously, they weren't dumb. They knew everything that we know now. They may not have known how things worked, or let's say they didn't know why things worked the way they did. They knew how to adjust them in such a way to make them work if something seemed off to them. It's very intuitional knowledge, and you can do that too. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying anybody has to have any of these gadgets to check these things, but I do think if you're going to go deep in the art of distillation, invest in it. Buy these gadgets, track those things, figure out what your yeast does, figure out what your malolactic bacteria does, figure out what your grain does, figure out what your sour mash does, figure out what your grape varieties do, figure out what the sugar content of those grape varieties is, and the pH of those grape varieties is. Same thing with any of the fruits you're going to play with. So that's just my opinion, and that stuff is so cheap nowadays and easy to use. Jump on Amazon and buy it, guys. I mean, if you break one of them, you're not out that much. All right, till next time, keep the questions coming. Dan, keep yours coming because they're always great questions, man. As far as the Facebook thing, the reason that I split it up is because Facebook and Instagram hate YouTube links. So if you put a YouTube link on Facebook or Instagram, it doesn't show up in everyone else's newsfeed. It'll show up in your newsfeed, and if they come to your page, they'll see it, but it won't show up in the newsfeed otherwise unless it's an Instagram or a Facebook video. And that's why I divide them up that way, just to try to make sure that everybody in the audience across all the platforms gets to see these things. So, all right, guys, till next time, I love y'all, and I'll catch you later.